year. It's finally 2021. We can leave 2020 in the past because we're hopefully on to better things. We'll just have to keep our fingers crossed for that. But today I'm here to do my favorite books of 2020. This is always one of my favorite videos to film because I love reflecting on my year of reading, and I love to talk about books that were truly standouts for me. I love sharing books that I absolutely love and would 1000% recommend. But this year it's actually a little bit different. It's a little bit, it's a little sadder, to be honest, because this was not a super great reading year for me. I ended up reading, I think, 84 books by the end of 2020, and I didn't really have any books that were true standouts. It was overall just kind of a meh year. I think my average rating for the books that I read this year was like a 3.5. So basically right around the middle of the scale. I mean, truly, I read a lot of just okay books. I have a selection of books for my favorites of the year, and I have a small selection of books to talk about in my least favorites of the year that's going to be coming out tomorrow. But for the most part, like, it was just an okay reading year. I typically do a top 10 books of the year type of video, but to be honest, I could not come up with 10 books that I wanted to talk about that were just absolute standouts for me this year. So I don't have 10 books to talk about today. I have 8 books that are my top books of 2020, and then I have one book that I wouldn't necessarily consider a favorite, but is one that I read pretty early on in the year and it stuck with me basically all year long, so it's kind of an honorable mention. I did decide to rank these this year. I didn't do a like from least favorite to most favorite last year, but I decided I wanted to bring that back for my channel this year. I decided that I would count down from number 9, I guess, to number 1, obviously being my favorite book of the year. So let's talk about my favorites of 2020, shall we? Coming in at, I guess, number 9, my honorable mention, not really technically in my top books of the year, but we can count it as number 9 if we want to, and that is My Year of Rest and Relaxation by Ottessa Moshfegh. This is a book that I read pretty early on in the year, like I said, and I really enjoyed it. It was something that completely took me by surprise as being a book that stuck with me after the fact. I read it in a pretty short amount of time, and while I was reading it, I was thinking, you know, this is good, but I don't know that it's gonna be like something that sticks with me beyond me reading this, and it really has. I have really thought about it a lot this year, and I'm glad that I read it because now I'm really excited to go back and read all of Ottessa Moshfegh's backlist and also all the books that she has coming out in the future. So if you don't know, this book is set in the year 2000, and it follows a woman who is basically just not having the best time. She is not happy with the way her life is going. So she decides that she is going to kind of hibernate for an entire year. She gets hooked up with this doctor who is continuously prescribing her sedatives, stuff that will make her stay asleep, and she just consistently takes these pills and sleeps and doesn't really interact with people or the world in general. Essentially, this book is just about her year of rest and relaxation, her going through the motions but not really being present in her life, and kind of like the effect that that has on the people around her, the people that are in her life, and her outlook on life. This is a pretty gritty novel. It definitely doesn't shy away from the gross bodily fluid type of descriptions. If that's something that would really bother you, then I would definitely steer clear of this. And from what I understand, Ottessa Moshfegh in general, that's kind of her writing style. So I don't know if she would be an author for you if those things affect you. I just thought that this was a really interesting character study about this girl who, to be honest, has a pretty good life. She is well off, she's got a job, she's got an apartment in New York City. She doesn't really have a lot to complain about, but she's also suffering from depression and anxiety, and she's constantly overwhelmed with her life. And so I just thought it was a really interesting look at the mind of a person who should be 100% happy but is still struggling all the time. And I just really enjoyed it. I mean, as much as you can enjoy a book like this, I really did enjoy it, and it definitely stuck with me all year long. And like I said, I'm excited to read more from Ottessa Moshfegh. I would definitely recommend it if it sounds like something you'd be interested in. I would classify this as like millennial fiction. This is definitely about like an early 20s girl who is just trying to figure things out. And so if you tend to like books like that, then this is one that I would definitely recommend giving a go. Not quite a favorite of the year, but definitely one that has stuck with me and probably will stick with me in the future, and I'm glad that I read it. Okay, so now my actual top books of the year list. Coming in at number 8 is a book that I'm kind of like using as a stand-in for an entire series, because I read this entire series this year and I really enjoyed it. It completely took me by surprise, and that was The Wicked King by Holly Black. This is of course the second book in the Folk of the Air trilogy, which is pretty popular here on BookTube. I would bet that if you haven't read it, you've at least heard of it. The first book is The Cruel Prince, and it's about a girl named Jude. She's a human girl who's been living in the Fae world, and she desperately wants to become a knight, but things always seem to be standing in her way, and she has a bit of a rivalry with the prince of the fairy realm. His name is Carden, and this series is just all about Jude trying to fulfill her destiny while also the, you know, day-to-day banter of her relationship with Prince Carden. I really enjoyed it. It really took me by surprise. Like I said, it wasn't a series that I thought about much. Like, it's a series obviously that's super hyped on BookTube, but it wasn't a series that I thought that's a series that I'm absolutely going to love. And I decided to do kind of like a weekend vlog of me binging this entire series. I'll leave a link to that down in the description if you want to go and check it out. Over the course of that vlog that weekend, I really just fell in love with the series, and the second book, The Wicked King, ended up being my favorite of the trilogy, so it is the one that I had to hold up and talk about in this video. You know, it's definitely overhyped in a lot of cases, and if YA fantasy doesn't typically tend to be your thing, then I would steer clear of this. If you don't really like fae stories, then I would steer clear of this. But I just thought it was a really good time, and that was something that really stuck out to me in 2020, is books that just I had a lot of fun with. And so The Wicked King, the Folk of the Air trilogy in general, definitely a favorite of 2020. Coming in at number 7 is a book that I'm sure you've seen on a lot of people's favorites lists for 2020, and that is The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue by V.E. Schwab. This is V.E. Schwab's newest release. It came out earlier this year, and I read it, and I really loved it, and it definitely lived up to the hype for me, and it was one that upon finishing it, I knew it was going to end up on my favorites of 2020. If somehow you don't know, this is about a girl named Addie LaRue. She is in her 20s and she's living in France in the 1700s, and she's kind of desperate to escape her life, and so she makes a deal with a devil-like creature, a demon-like creature, to essentially live forever, but she is cursed with the fact that nobody will remember her. She can be talking to someone, and as soon as she walks away or as soon as they leave the room, they forget who she is. And this book is all about her living for several hundred years, just going about her day to day, not being remembered by anybody, and then she meets a boy who somehow does remember her. And it's all about her relationship with this boy, and it's also about this boy and why he has the ability to remember her, and it's just a really good book. I have had kind of an up and down relationship with V.E. Schwab's books in the past. I have read some that I absolutely loved, and I've read some that I thought were the worst, and I've read some that were just okay. In my opinion, as someone who has had such an up and down relationship with V.E. Schwab's books, this is her best work. This book, you can tell that she put so much of herself into. She really took the time to craft this story, and I just really enjoyed it. The last 30 to 50 pages was just me sobbing uncontrollably trying to get to the end of this book. I really loved it. It's a book that I can see myself rereading for years to come. I do think it has a very specific audience, but if it sounds like something you'd enjoy, if you've liked V.E. Schwab's books in the past, if you just like this kind of story, then I would definitely recommend giving it a go. It was really good. I'm so glad that I decided to read it, and I just love it, and I can't recommend it enough. Next up, number 6 is Dear Martin by Nick Stone. This is about a boy named Justice who is going to this kind of elite private school in, I think in Atlanta, and he is one of only a handful of black kids that go to his school, and he is constantly kind of like having to prove himself, kind of having to prove who he is in his academics and that he deserves to be at this school. At the beginning of the book, he is driving his girlfriend home from a party, and he gets pulled over by a police officer who essentially thinks that he is trying to take advantage of this girl who is white passing. As a black boy in this affluent white neighborhood, he is kind of accosted by this police officer, and it really affects his outlook on the way he lives his life from that point on. And so in an effort to understand what has happened to him, Justice starts writing letters to Martin Luther King Jr. And so while this book is a story of Justice coming to terms with what's happened to him and kind of coming into himself throughout the course of the book, it's also interspersed with these letters to Martin Luther King Jr. trying to understand what is going on in the world. And I really loved this book. I read it in the summer, right around the time that there was a resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement after the death of George Floyd. And I felt like it was a good time to read the book because I was trying to read and consume things that were going to educate me on how to be a better ally to people of color. I can't believe that I waited so long to read a book by Nick Stone because I ended up really loving it. It was one of very few 5-star reads that I had in 2020, and I'm so glad that I finally read it. I'm excited to read more from Nick Stone in the future. I'm definitely excited to read the sequel to this book. It's kind of a companion called Dear Justice. It came out earlier this year and I just haven't managed to get around to reading it yet, but it's pretty high on my priority list for 2021. Even though if you're not typically a fan of like hard-hitting YA contemporary, I think this is a book that everybody could get something out of, and I would definitely recommend picking it up. My next two books for my favorites list I read in, I think August, or yeah, I think I read them in August, and I didn't do a wrap-up of these books, so I've not talked about them on my channel. They're two nonfiction books. The first is Navigate Your Stars by Jesmyn Ward. This is like a speech, I believe, that Jesmyn Ward gave maybe at some kind of commencement ceremony, or maybe it's just like a little book of advice that she wrote. It's really short. I think it's like less than 50 pages, and it's all about like following your dreams and trying to figure out what exactly you want to do with your life. I read this at the exact perfect moment in my life. I don't know that it would have had quite an impact on me if I hadn't read it when I did, and I think that's why it ended up being a favorite of the year. It's why it's on this list. I read this book when I was going through a transitional period. I was really hating my job, and I was trying to kind of figure out what I was gonna do. I was trying to figure out what my next steps were, and after I read this book, I ended up deciding to apply for some other jobs, and I ended up applying to a job and got an interview, went to the interview, got offered the job, and fell into a much better situation than I was previously in. It's the current job that I have. Obviously, I think I've talked about it a little bit on my channel. This job is such a great job for me. I love it so much. It's really a perfect job for me, and I've already grown a lot in this new company, and I have figured out kind of like what I want to do for at least the foreseeable future. And so reading this book at that time, it just basically changed my whole mindset, and it gave me that push to try to get out of the situation that I was in and find something that was better for me. And then I ended up doing it. I ended up finding a job that is just perfect for me and so great for my mental health. Like, I just feel a lot better every day coming home from work. That's why this book is on my favorites of the year list. I would recommend it, especially if you are getting ready to graduate college, or if you're just out of school and you're trying to figure out what you're going to do next. I think it's a perfect book for that. But also, if you are kind of stuck on what you want to do with your life, if you're in a situation that you're not happy with, then read this book, because it gave me the motivation to better my situation, and I think it could do that for everybody. So I loved it, and I would recommend it, even though I think it's for a very specific kind of person. I do think it's really great, and I couldn't be happier that I read it this year, and it changed my whole life, so it's obviously on my favorites of the year. Coming in at number 4 is Hood Feminism by Mickey Kendall. This is a book all about intersectional feminism. This is like the text to read if you are wanting to educate yourself on intersectional feminism. I read this and it just blew me away. It covers so many topics, from like sexuality to race to disability. It's religion. It really covers everything, and it is such a wide scope of information. I would consider myself fairly educated on feminism. I do read a lot of feminist texts, and I do consider myself a feminist, and even me reading this, I learned so much about things that I could do better to be a better feminist. I think that it's always important to continue educating ourselves, and this book definitely educated me, and so I really enjoyed it. I think that it's a perfect place to start if you are trying to read more feminist texts. This is like the one that you need to pick up, and I loved it, and I would definitely recommend it. I listened to the audiobook, which is narrated by the author, and I really enjoyed that experience. I just think that this is a book that everybody should read. It should be required reading, and I think you should read it as well. My third favorite book of 2020 is another book that I am gonna hold up in place of an entire series, or at least what is out of the series so far, and that is The Governess Game by Tessa Dare. This is the second book in the Girl Meets Duke series. The fourth and final book of this series is coming out in February, and it is probably my most anticipated release of 2021. I'm so excited about it, and I am going to reread the entire series in preparation for that book. I fell in love with this series in 2020, and it is definitely a favorite. It also introduced me to a new genre that I am really excited to read more of in the future, and that is historical romance. So if you don't know, this series follows a group of 4 friends who, in various circumstances and situations, find themselves falling in love with different dukes in London in the 1800s. My personal favorite in the series is the Governess Game because it has one of my absolute favorite tropes, if not like my favorite trope right now, and that is broody, grumpy men becoming dads. I just really love this series, and I'm so excited to read the 4th and final book. Like I said, I'll probably reread it a ton of times. I think I read the series, like the first 3 books, 3 or 4 times in 2020 just because I read it whenever I wanted to feel happy, and I needed to feel happy a lot. So I read the series a lot, but I really loved it. Definitely a favorite, and I would highly recommend it if you are interested in historical romance. This is a really great series to start with. My second favorite book of 2020, I had a hard time kind of deciding between this and number 1 because for the whole year, I kept thinking, the book that I put in the number 2 spot, that is my favorite book of the year. And when I sat down and kind of like evaluated my list and really trying to rank from, you know, least favorite to most favorite, I had to be honest with myself and say that the book that I ended up putting in number 1 was actually my favorite book of 2020, and the book that I thought was my favorite book of 2020 basically all year is actually number 2, and that is Sorcery of Thorns by Margaret Rogerson. This is another YA fantasy. This is a standalone. I read Margaret Rogerson's previous book, An Enchantment of Ravens. I read it last year, or 2019. It's already 2021, so I'm getting a little confused. I read her previous book in 2019 and I really enjoyed it, but it wasn't like an all-time favorite. But then when everybody was reading Sorcery of Thorns and everybody was raving about it, I knew that it was a book that I had to check out, and when I read it, I fell in love. So this book follows a girl named Elizabeth who lives in one of the great magical libraries. She's training to be a librarian in this magical library, and one of the things that this library houses are grimoires, which are essentially texts that if they are not properly cared for, they could turn into monsters. At the beginning of the book, Elizabeth is caught in the library after a grimoire has been turned into a monster and ended up killing one of the other librarians at this place. So she is sent to the main city in this kingdom, and she is going to be put on trial for killing this other librarian, even though she didn't do it. And then one of the most powerful sorcerers in the kingdom says, I don't think she did it. I think that she can help us find out what exactly is going on. And so she goes to live at the sorcerer's house, and she is caught up in this investigation, trying to figure out what exactly is happening with these grimoires. And she also might start falling in love with this sorcerer. And it's just an excellent book. If you liked Howl's Moving Castle, then this is a book that I definitely would recommend checking out because it has a lot of the same energy, a lot of the same vibes, and I just really liked it. It also has one of my favorite side characters ever, and I just think it's just one of the most fun books that I've ever read. It definitely stuck with me this year, and I would definitely recommend picking it up if it sounds like something you'd be interested in. I do think that there is something for everybody in this, so I would recommend checking it out. I think you could really enjoy it. And finally, my favorite book of 2020, a book that I just have not been able to stop thinking about all year long, a book that I'm so excited to continue on and read the rest in the series, and that is Furyborn by Claire Legrand. This is the first book in the Imperium trilogy. It is kind of YA, but I would actually consider it probably more like new adult because it definitely veers a little bit more into adult topics, but it follows teenagers, so it's kind of like that middle ground. This is set in a world where there has always been this prophecy that 2 queens would rise, a blood queen and a sun queen. The blood queen is prophesied to destroy the world, and the sun queen is prophesied to save it. And this story follows 2 girls who are living in 2 completely separate timelines who might end up being the blood queen and the sun queen. One timeline is set way in the past, like 1,000 years in the past, and it follows a girl named Riel, who is believed to be the Sun Queen. She has magical abilities, and throughout the course of the story, the kingdom believes that she is going to be the Sun Queen. And then the other half of the story is set 1,000 years later. It's following a girl named Eliana, who doesn't really know very much about her past, her history, herself at all. And throughout the course of the story, she discovers that she might play a little bit bigger role in this world than she has ever thought. This is definitely my favorite book of 2020. I cannot believe I love this as much as I did, because when I went into it and I was starting it, I was thinking, you know, this is probably going to be a typical YA fantasy. No. There's so much in this book. There's so much action, so much adventure, so much intrigue, so much just goodness in here that I loved it so much. So I haven't continued on with the series yet, but I am planning on finishing it in 2021. It is one of my highest priority reads for this next year, and I'm so excited about it. And I would honestly just, I love this so much, and I would highly, highly, highly recommend that you check it out. This is just fantastic. If any book on this entire list would be considered like a new all-time fave, it would probably be Reborn, because it's really good. I really loved it, and for sure my favorite book of 2020. So those are my favorite books of 2020. A lot of fantasy. I will admit there's a ton of fantasy, mostly fantasy with some contemporary and a little bit of nonfiction, which is always good. I love having kind of a mix. I'm really hopeful that 2021 will be a better reading year for me. I wouldn't say that it was the worst reading year ever in 2020, but I will say that it was probably the least I read in quite a few years, and the least amount of 5-star reads that I had. Just like I said, I didn't have any like truly true standouts. There was only a handful of books that I really loved, and I couldn't even come up with a top 10, which is just sad to me. I wanted to have more books that I absolutely loved, but it is what it is. We all have those years sometimes, and 2020 was one of those years for me. I'm just hopeful that this next year will be infinitely better. Let me know down in the comments if you've read any of the books that I mentioned in this video and what you thought of them. Do you consider any of these your favorites as well? Were any of these books that were your favorites of 2020? I'd really love to know. Also, let me know what some of your favorite books of the year were, or what was your absolute favorite book of 2020? I'd really love to know that down in the comments as well. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I will see you again very soon with my least favorites of 2020. Bye!